some tea, got a lightning bolt, got everything I need for a podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. You can play him as a skilled computer programmer and web developer, or you can play him as a pickling expert, Maddox.
Is this like a video game reference? I feel like you're
you're
character
modal.
selection.
You're modal. It's modal. Come on, give me a break. I'm not saying play you like a puppet master, like, you know, pull the strings or whatever. I mean, cast you as a magic card. It's a magic podcast.
I understand. Yes. Yep. It's a magic podcast. But if you wanted this to be a pickle podcast, I could also be ready for that.
We got to record more. Magic doesn't exist.
We do.
I'm backed up on episodes. We've had just a busy fall.
Busy fall. Everything falls at once.
All the leaves, all of my calendar events. They're all fallen. We are returning to one of our long-started series, which you just listened to the first one in this series. When did we actually release that?
This was from last June, and I thought we would get back to this in a couple weeks, but it's been a bit.
Yeah, so in June, we started an overview of all of Magic's modal mechanics in chronological order according to release. We made it through like 2004 in one episode, and then we had to call it quits because it was going too long. And so we are back to pick up where we left off and see where we get to. And our goal in this series is to, take a walk down memory lane, do a little history, a little archaeology here, and talk about Magic's mechanics and history and how we got to where we are today. And also to do that with a specific lens on cube design and talk about how these mechanics might impact cube design decisions, or how you might think about them with regards to designing your own cubes, which is, of course, what we do in this podcast, design lots of cubes.
And we talked previously on that episode about how it's kind of difficult to define modal mechanics. There are some that are very explicit. Things like the commands and things like split cards. It's like you can't really get much more explicit than that. It's just here's two different cards you can cast. But there is, as always, like a long tail of things that are kind of modal-y.
Wow, how long since we said long tail? I feel like it's been a long time.
Just sitting down and trying to come up with a list of like what are the modal mechanics is kind of challenging. So I'm sure we'll miss some, we'll come back to some, and probably argue about some others.
And we should start where we left off with, looks like, according to your notes here, Transmute in Ravnica City of Guilds circa 2005.
Can we actually start with rehashing an argument which I said on that previous episode that Lightning Bolt is kind of a modal card, maybe the first modal spell in Alpha.
Now, hold on, time out. Can I just guess? Because you listened to the episode, I have not. Can I guess what I said?
Yeah, sure. You said, shut up.
I feel like I probably said... Yes, I agree. Lightning Bolt is modal in the sense that it can do all kinds of things. It can kill your opponent. It can remove a creature. It can throw off combat. It can counter an aura or something. I probably said a bunch of things about that, but I also feel like the whole point of this series should be to talk about more explicitly modal mechanics and not every single card in Magic's history you could potentially use in multiple ways.
You didn't really say that, but I think that's a much more constructed, thoughtful argument, so I appreciate
What
that.
did I say? I can't wait to go back and listen now.
You said, no, shut up.
Shut up.
Exactly. You can do a better impression of you than me. I do think it's interesting to think about Lightning Bolt as a modal mechanic, though, because it's kind of a quirk of semantics, like the way that the rule system of Magic is built. And I think that we could just reconstruct the language of Magic, and it would absolutely fit the very strict definition of a modal spell. So specifically, if we said, like, okay, it's part of the mechanics that damage to a creature and damage to a player. We use the same language for that. We frame it the same as like you have your life total and a creature has their toughness and we damage them both in the same way. We could easily just restructure all of Magic and say, well, instead of damaging a player, you're gaining victory points. And when a creature deals combat damage, you gain that many victory points. And when you get to 20, you win the game. And in that sense, then you could just have Lightning Bolt say it deals 3 damage to a creature or you gain 3 victory points. And it would seem totally modal. It's just this sort of like semantic quirk. I think it's worth casting that unrest of like, all of this just depends on the language that we're using to define modality.
I mean, in the abstract, I definitely agree. But also, we don't live in that world. We live in this world where Magic is constructed the way that it is.
Both are the same. It's just a matter of the lens that you use to describe it.
I was watching one of my dumb YouTube videos. One of the more popular channels I enjoy is Colin Furze, who is this guy in the UK that does just over-the-top engineering projects and has gotten famous enough on YouTube that he has seemingly endless resources. Also, very interestingly, he has never moved from the house he's always lived in. He lives in a very normal person home in a suburb or whatever that's small yard, like not a big house for how rich I think he is. But instead, he has like dug an entire series of tunnels and secret rooms under his house.
So he's basically living in the reality of The Neighborhood Listen, but for real.
Pretty much.
Does he have a sizzler in his house?
One of his big projects right now is he is building a whole garage under his driveway to park his DeLorean on so that he can press a button and his DeLorean rises out of his driveway.
Classic male behavior.
Yeah, he's truly just, if you gave a 12-year-old infinite resources, which I think is, I don't mean that to sound judgmental. I think it's beautiful that Colin has maintained such a playful attitude in his adulthood and has not been ruined and worn down by the world. But in one of his most recent videos, he built a bike that, instead of suspension, uses opposing magnets. So the frame is actually not touching. It is like suspended in air by magnets at these moments, which is a crazy thing to do. He had to buy like insanely powerful magnets to do this. And he was saying that working with these magnets, he was thinking about how if you are metal, this magnet is like this hugely important object. It has this crazy strong force that like has a huge like sway over your life, right? Like it's like any metal object in my shop is like completely altered by the presence of this huge magnet. And he's like, anything made of wood doesn't care at all. And it just makes you think that like there could be really strong forces that like you're just not attuned to, that like don't affect you, that are like they're real, they're in the world, but you're just not sensitive to them. And that sort of observation just stuck with me. He was like, what if we're just wood and there's some force that we are not attuned to that is like dictating the entire universe and we just don't feel it?
I mean, that's literally that's literally what dark energy is, right? It's just like we think we just need this to make the math work and it doesn't affect us at all.
Yeah, I guess. So anyway, that's a cool way to think about the world.
I agree. Great.
Would you like to spend the entire episode talking about the dark energy of Magic's modal mechanics?
No, but I do relate to that feeling of...
A basic land could be very modal. It could say reduce the cost of any spell by 1. It could say reduce the cost of any ability by 1. It could say...
Activate this ability only once each turn.
Only this ability once each turn. Yeah, you could definitely write everything in a crazy way.
Isn't language cool, though?
That's
all
cool.
I really wanted to say.
Language is cool.
I relate to that never moving comment, though. I was just looking at my fermentation station last night, and I'm just like, can I leave this house ever?
Why would you want to leave your house? It's beautiful.
Wouldn't. It's a great house.
It's beautiful. It's perfect location. Yeah, I mean, the things he does to his house are crazy. He's clearly not worried about, like, the effort of moving. Like, I think it's just his family just lives there, and he's like, this is where we live. I don't know. I think it's quite beautiful without actually knowing the reason behind it.
It's almost like he's transmuted his entire house.
He absolutely has transmuted his entire house. Transmute, Anthony, the mechanic from Ravnica City of Guilds. What'd it do?
Transmute is a mechanic that says, discard this card, search your library for a card with the same mana value, reveal it and put it into your hand, and shuffle. So it's basically...
And you pay some cost.
And you pay the cost, and it is a different cost from the mana cost. But it's basically like a tutor tacked onto a card that does something else. It's a creature, it's a spell, it does whatever you want, but you can get something that has... Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused in the weeds. You're discarding it for a cost, but you search for something that has the same mana value
as the card
itself.
I always think of Richard Garfield, PhD. You're transmuting this card into another 2-drop, or another 3-drop, or another 4-drop, or whatever.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What do you think about Transmute? It's not a big mechanic. There's only 15, 14 cards with it.
I honestly kind of love it from a cube design perspective. I can see how the design space would be extraordinarily limited from a, like, standard constructed Magic perspective, because tutors are very volatile. They can have a huge sway over a constructed metagame if you introduce efficient tutors. But in Cube, these are actually kind of the exact sort of tutors that I like, these sort of like toolbox tutors. When you're forced to draft your deck instead of just build it from a whole pool of constructed available cards, then you can get a Transmute card and say like, okay, well now every pick that I take that is, also a 2-drop or also a 3-drop is inherently a lot better because it's now part of this sort of Transmute package. I'm actually probably going to be exploring a number of Transmute cards in Take 5 for this reason. I think it's really interesting there. And the trade-off, I think, for most Cube environments is that the spell itself tends to be pretty overcosted because it's got a pretty powerful secondary mode. And so if you just bolted that to like a spell that was like very good as a baseline, that would be a crazy good card. And so what you get is kind of like some pretty dinky, clunky cards with Transmute, and by virtue of that, I think a lot of designers look at that, or even players in the draft look at that and think, well, this card isn't very appealing because neither of these modes are very efficient, which is, I'm sure, something we talked about in the first episode of the modal mechanics overview. The fact that when you make a thing modal, you got to make the base rate a little worse in order to keep the card in the whole as powerful.
You don't have to. Increasingly, they don't seem to anymore.
Okay, fair.
It makes sense. It's a coherent philosophy of design.
I mean, you have to if you want, like, if you're saying taking card A and you're adding a modality to it, and you want the resulting card to be the same exact power level in the abstract.
You want those cards to be in dialogue with each other.
Yes, then you need to make the main effect a little worse. But yeah, that's my thoughts on Transmute. I think it's actually very cool, and it's a little bit of a bummer, I think, from a cube design perspective, that they're probably not going to print a ton of Transmute cards ever again because it's such a limited design space, or it seems to me like such a limited design space.
I think that sort of difference between constructed and a cube environment is really worth underscoring, because I agree that, like, tutors, to me, I have a little bit of maybe still a bad taste in my mouth about them, but I think so much of that is just because in constructed, like, you're putting tutors in your deck because you just want more redundancy to do the same thing, and they can tend to make gameplay more repetitive. I mean, I remember from Commander, the one Transmute card that I'd see a lot was Teleria West, which would go tutor up your Mana Crypt, which I guess they solved that problem in a different way, but it just, made games more the same every time and more streamlined in a way that wasn't appealing to what I find the most fun about Magic, which is, like, solving these interesting problems and kind of putting yourself in janky situations you need to navigate your way out of. But in a cube environment, there's so much variance and so much noise from the draft itself that I think having cards that are tutors, I'm softening to a little bit more. And I think especially this discussion of modal cards is interesting, given some of the cube design you've been doing lately, where you're just forcing players to play with more of their cards. It allows other sort of strategies to mitigate that variance of just being forced to play with a bunch of cards you don't necessarily intend to. In that context, I feel like the knock is that all of these Transmute cards, the colored mana cost is the same as the spell itself, which kind of reduces the range of that modality, and also makes it less modal in the sense that you definitely need access to those colors to be able to use the card.
It's also just in Dimir, is the Dimir mechanic. All the cards are blue or blue-black. In case somebody listening has never heard of a Transmute card, let's give a couple examples. The two that I think are most interesting to me, and I feel like will have a lot of applications in some cubes, are actually the two counter spells. Muddle the Mixture is blue for an instant, counter target instant or sorcery spell. So like I said, the front side is, by, broad standards, kind of bad. That's a very narrow range. It's not just non-creature, it's just instant or sorcery, and it costs the same as a full actual counter spell. But then it has Transmute for 1 blue, and you can do that only as a sorcery, importantly. I'm not sure we said that. You can only transmute as a sorcery, which is a very big limiting factor.
That's really relevant on this card specifically.
Yeah. So for 1 blue, you can transmute this into another 2-drop in your deck, and just go put that card into your hand. The other one, which I think is maybe the most compelling design, is Perplex. 1 blue-black for an instant, counter target spell unless its controller discards his or her hand, or their hand by modern Oracle text standards, and transmute for the same cost for 1 blue-black. That's much closer to like a cancel. Unless they're hellbent or only have one card left in hand, they're probably not going to want to discard their hand to let their spell resolve. But of course, we all know that when you give your opponent choices, they will always choose the one that is best for them. And so even if in the abstract you're like, well, if it said 1 blue-black, discard 3 cards, that would be good. And so why isn't it good to either counter a spell or make them discard 3 cards? And the answer is because they will always choose the one that is better for them. And maybe they want to discard their reanimation outlet or whatever. You never know. So yeah, that's the kind of cards we're looking at for Transmute. And like you said, not a lot in all of Magic's history.
Were there other knocks? I know Mark Rosor has talked about this mechanic specifically, and I think the big issue is just adding like a bunch of tutors to a standard environment was not necessarily a ton of fun. Were there other issues with this mechanic that you remember?
I don't know. I will say I'm quite surprised. We got a Transmute card in Teleria West in Planar Chaos, but we never in Modern Horizons ever got another Transmute card. I'm a little surprised there wasn't like 1 or 2 sprinkled in Transmute cards in a Modern Horizons set.
Since you brought up Perplex, I had another question about modality and sort of like a type of card that seems modal. What do you think about cards that give your opponent a choice? Is that modal in the same way, or is that in some ways maybe the opposite of a modal spell because you have less control?
I think it's the opposite for the purposes of our conversation here. Because, yeah, you don't get to choose. It's almost like, from your perspective, it's random. Except it's not random. It's your opponent's always choosing the best option for them. Unless your opponent is really bad. In which case, it could be better than random.
I think sometimes my opponents feel that way.
So that is Transmute. I think the one actually that I'm going to find some room for, maybe in Take 5 specifically, is Shred Memory, which is 1 and a black to exile 4 target cards at a single graveyard from the game, or transmute for 1 black at instant speed. You can't transmute at instant speed, it is an instant. And I'm looking at that specifically because in that cube, it's starting to look like there's a lot of important kind of build-aroundy 2-drops. And I want you to be able to go get your Sundial of the Infinite or your Isochron Scepter or whatever with one of these cards, where you're, a survival of the fittest to start, turning on your whole deck. Those are the ones that are kind of interesting to me.
I love how you, as the cube designer in this context, have gone from like, oh, is there any way that I can make Sundial of the Infinite appealing to this is the key card that everybody like wants to draft and wants to find ways to get redundancy for?
I genuinely think it is one of the better cards in that cube right now. It is.
I mean, that's exciting to me.
It's kind of dummy. What's next, Anthony?
The next one I've got on my list is Forecast, which is another like weird oddball mechanic that was just printed on a couple cards in one of the Ravnica sets. This is another one that I'm like, there's a couple cards here that I think are kind of cool and would love to find room for in some cubes. In particular, Sky Hussar. I'll just read this to give us a sense of the mechanic. It's 5 mana, 3 white, blue for a 4/3 flying creature. When it enters the battlefield, untap all creatures you control, and then it has this Forecast ability. Tap 2 untapped white and blue creatures you control. Reveal Sky Hussar from your hand. Draw a card. You can only do it during your upkeep and only once each turn. Again, this is a one where I'm like, is this even a modal mechanic? It's like kind of just like there's 2 different mechanics on this card, but baked into every card with Forecast is this idea that you're either playing it as your normal spell or you get this slightly different ability and often related ability that you can only do during your upkeep.
It's a really funky one, and I, as a designer, really dislike the things you must do during your upkeep, which is something they've gotten away from a lot in Magic. But it used to be in the early days, there were a lot of things that would just, I'm thinking of Undead Gladiator, a card that I always resent.
I always look at it and I'm like, this card is perfect for whatever cube I'm brewing, and then I remember that you have to commit to doing the thing before you draw your card for the turn,
which is such a bummer because then you will draw a card and potentially have, made the wrong choice, right? And obviously, from a game design perspective, like, it's still an interesting decision to make, but from a, like, emotional perspective, I think it really is not fun to have to make, like, decisions about what you're doing with your resources in your turn before you draw your card for the turn. In that regard, I think Sky Hussar is maybe one of the most elegant Forecast designs because it does not cost you any mana.
Exactly,
It only makes you tap creatures you control. You can probably, whether you attack or not that turn is probably much less dictated by what card you're about to draw than whether you want to spend mana during your upkeep. And so I think that is also the most appealing Forecast card to me of the, 11 that there are. There's not very many of them. And it's because of that reason. Pride of the Clouds is also, I think, a resonant design, but a perfect example of, like, I don't want to decide if I'm spending 4 mana to make a 1/1 and draw a card during my upkeep. And I'm shortcutting that because you don't have to get, like, it's modal, but you can do this as many times as you want. That's the important thing about Forecast. Like,
well,
it does
once per turn, but you're not discarding the card. Right. You're just revealing it and saying, I'm activating this ability of this card in my hand.
It does not use the card up in your hand. You can then just keep doing that, next turn, turn over turn, which for that reason, you have to look at all of the effects as, basically like you are drawing a card in addition to getting the effect. Because the Forecast on Pride of the Clouds is 2 white-blue, reveal it from your hand, put a 1/1 white and blue bird creature token with flying into play. 4 mana for a 1/1 seems like an awful rate. But then you have to remember, it didn't cost you a card. It's like an activated ability of like an enchantment in play or something, except even better because they are likely much harder to interact with something in your hand than an enchantment in play. It's a really funky mechanic that I think overall is not very elegant because it requires you to do this during your upkeep, and also it is like you're repeatedly activating an ability of a card in a zone that is very difficult for all colors in Magic, save for black, to interact with, which is a bummer.
Yeah, and we had talked about that a little bit last week with, what was the card? The 4 mana blink a creature every turn card?
Teleportation Circle.
Teleportation Circle. It's like, do you really want games where it's just like, this is what I do now. This is the rest of the game is I'm going to blink this Blade Splicer every turn and make another 3/3. I don't know. Sometimes, maybe not all the time. But yeah, I mean, I think I've often heard people read Sagas and be like, why isn't this triggered in the upkeep? That would feel so much more natural. And those people have not played with Undead Gladiator and felt how frustrating it is to have a trigger happen and you have to make decisions before you know that card you're drawing for turn. So, I mean, I think that's a great observation that the ones that have a mana cost are so much less appealing for that specific reason. And I think that even though this is a very narrow mechanic, that lesson applies to a lot of other mechanics.
I wonder if we could rewind time and go back in history if they would just put the upkeep after the draw step now.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, I think the reason that they always put things there is because they made a space. Like, the upkeep is designed to be the space where, like, turn over turn stuff happens and you, like, have to make decisions about things. It's kind of awkward to write on a card at the beginning of your first main phase as triggers. It's a much more sort of wordy trigger to write, even though from a texture of play perspective, it feels so much better. And so I wonder if in hindsight, and there are certainly things that would be messed up by this, change, but I wonder if in hindsight,
you would have to rewrite a lot of cards.
They would have just moved the upkeep to after the draw step if they had realized what they now know after, 30 plus years, 35 plus years of Magic R&D. I do want to give a shout out to the one Modern Horizons card with Forecast, Piercing Rays, which is a very cool use of the mechanic that is like very resonant or, I don't know, cohesive, which is 1 and a white, sorcery, exile target tap creature, and you can forecast it by paying 2 and a white to reveal it from your hand to tap target untapped creature. So obviously, you can tap a creature that was untapped to then remove it with Piercing Rays, or you can just tap down a thing every single turn for 3 mana if you are just an aggro deck and just want to be attacking and you don't want to spend this card out of your hand, you want to keep it in hand as a tapper. Pretty cool Modern Horizons design.
Yeah, I mean, again, I love that sort of aspect of modal mechanics where the modes can kind of be strung together in a way that sort of creates a narrative. And yeah, this being a 2-mana destroy target tap creature or a funky 5-mana destroy any creature.
And then also shout out to the art on Plumes of Peace. Justin Sweet knocked it out of the park on that one. Next up is one of my favorite modal mechanics, and also, honestly, a modal mechanic that is a little bit of a heartbreaker for me, and that is Evoke from Lorwyn. This is a mechanic they have come back to a couple of times, and Evoke basically says you may play this spell for its Evoke cost. If you do, it's sacrificed when it comes into play. So the Evoke costs tend to be on creatures with enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield or die triggers so that it makes any sense to evoke them. And the Evoke cost is almost always cheaper than the casting cost of the spell because you don't get to keep the creature, you just get the ability. This is, I think, a really, really cool way to do combination creatures and spells, right? Like creatures that are also spells. And I say it's a little bit of a heartbreaker because the cards that have gotten Evoke over the years are a bunch of creatures from Lorwyn, which are
all cool and great, and we love them.
They're cool and great, and we love them, but they are, first of all, by modern standards, not super powerful. But more importantly, I think they follow old sort of templating and, R&D patterns. Like Shriekmaw is a heartbreaking card to me because it is a perfect card, except it has fear and it only destroys non-artifact, non-black creatures. Just give me a Shriekmaw that just destroys a creature and has menace, right? Like that would be like an incredible card that I would put in like basically every cube that I could run it in. But unfortunately, they're all the way back in Lorwyn. 2007 is when these cards were designed and printed, and so they just follow sort of old school play patterns. Or most of the other returns to Evoke are Modern Horizons, where they just went to the complete other side of the spectrum and absolutely cranked them off the top of the deep end. The Evoke elementals from Modern Horizons that you can evoke for free by discarding cards from your hand, like in the sort of Force of Will style, are just crazy strong. And there's very few things in between. Like, Knight Incarnate is a very cool card that was from a commander set that is actually kind of in this in-between space. And I just desperately wish we had more Evoke cards that were in that in-between space instead of all being from Lorwyn block or from absolutely cracked Modern Horizons sets.
There's a couple commons from the Modern Horizons set.
Yes, there are. You're right.
Foundation Breaker is a card that I enjoy in some cubes.
It's fine.
It's fine.
That one honestly feels like it was balanced for Lorwyn.
A little bit, yeah. Evoke is such a cool mechanic because in some ways it kind of reads like reverse kicker. It's like, I can do this spell ability because this creature has entered the battlefield effect, but if I can pay the full mana cost, I also get this additional creature body with it. But it does so many things that kicker doesn't, because the fact that a creature is entering the battlefield and then going to the graveyard means so many other things can key off of it and care about it. And also, like you pointed out with Revelark, it can not just be an ETB, it can also be a dies trigger or leaves the battlefield trigger, which just means there's lots of ways for this fairly simple mechanic to get complex in ways that I think really triggers the kind of like creative response of a lot of Magic players. And especially finding those narrow things, because it's even the sacrifices a triggered ability, gives you even more space to say, well, I evoke this and then I sacrifice it while the creature is still in play, or I'll blink it so I get to keep the creature.
Or I end the turn with Sundial the Infinite.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
I am absolutely Sundial pilled right now. Fair warning
this
to
is great.
you and all listeners.
You. This podcast could end at any moment if you choose to activate your Sundial of the podcast.
Yeah, there's so many things you can do with it. I mean, even just, having a Mayhem Devil in play is so sick. It makes these cards like have all these little edges that just, work in so many cool ways. I will say, this is the first mechanic we've talked about that we know we are returning to very shortly. We are coming back to this in the new Lorwyn set. We've already gotten 2 cards spoiled with Evoke from the new Lorwyn set, so we know for sure. Yeah.
Are they also heartbreakers, or are they very cool and great?
They are. Heartbreaking is overstating it. We've seen Deceit and Emptiness, and what they are exploring, at least at Mythic Rare, is a new take on Evoke, where the Evoke cost is hybrid mana, and the effect you get depends on whether or not you paid 2 of the A color or 2 of the B color, which means that they are additionally modal. So not only are they now modal in the sense that they are a spell or a creature, but they also are 2 separate spells, potentially. Which, as a sort of baseline, I think is maybe interesting. We've only seen 2 mythic rares from the set so far. I really hope this mechanic is also at uncommon and rare and common, and we get some more sort of bread and butter. Like, these are very splashy, sort of fancy cards that are going to be...
Yeah, fancy cards. I like that.
Yeah, there's only so much room, and they take up a complexity budget in your cube design. That means that you have to be kind of committed to the vibes of one of these big cards to be excited about including them. Whereas I'm mostly excited about, like, give me, like, a good cantrip creature with Evoke. Give me a good removal spell creature with Evoke. Give me, like, a Mana War with Evoke. I'm really interested in having those basic sort of building blocks with modern sort of development sensibilities so that I can use them in many, many cube design projects. I don't think Deceit is going to be like here's a toolbox you can put in tons of cubes.
No, definitely not. I mean...
Because at six mana, it's crazy. At 6 mana, assuming you can use blue, and black, you get to bounce a thing and also Thoughtseize your opponent, and you get a 5/5.
That seems pretty good.
It's extremely good.
I'm very excited to see if they also bring this mechanic back at common, if there's just more, like, solid bread and butter with a little extra sauce. Like, I mean, because Shriekmaw is not totally a bread and butter card. It's like a step above complexity of Doomblade, but a step above complexity in a way that, I just think really appeals to cube designers, and I'd love to see what else they can do with it.
I do think broadly it is pretty simple. Like, it is not like an example of the most basic kind of Magic card, but I would put something like that in Sacred Geometry, I think, for sure. It's a Ravenous Cube Cobra or a Doomblade and has all the sort of long tail, did it again, ding, 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 of the synergies we talked about that care about creatures entering the battlefield or sacrificing themselves. I have one last thing to say about Evoke. I hate Ephemerate. I hate that stupid card. And I hate that the Evoke cycle, the Evoke elementals in combination with Ephemerate has made people just look at Evoke and think, all I want to do is cheat this creature into play now. That, to me, is a tragedy that people look at this mechanic, and I think a lot of people just see, okay, how do I now ephemerate this with the Evoke trigger on the stack to get 3 triggers instead of, 1, and also keep my creature for, like, no mana.
Okay, so you hate Ephemerate. You don't hate Evoke.
No, I love Evoke. Evoke is my sweet, sweet baby child, my precious baby, and Ephemerate is the bad influence that they go off to school every day and are learning how to do drugs or, burn ants with magnifying glass. That's Ephemerate.
It is interesting. There are lots of mechanics or individual cards that end up getting sort of put in a corner because people are used to seeing them in a very specific context. And then when you recontextualize them, people might just not really notice. I mean, I feel like some cards I think about that are maybe more iconic are things like Wheel of Fortune or Yawgmoth's Will that people might look at and think, oh yeah, these are Storm cards. I'm going to put them in my Vintage Cube and just play Storm. But the value Wheel of Fortune in your aggro deck in like a low-powered cube, I think can be a ton of fun. And maybe this is a similar case where, you're saying Ephemerate really changed the way people thought about those cards.
I think it did. And also... the other reason I don't like Ephemerate is because one of my first loves in like kitchen table Magic before I knew anything about the game was Cloud Shift, which is just Ephemerate, but you only get it once instead of twice. And I don't know, maybe hot take, that was kind of the right balance level for that card. Like, I don't think Ephemerate has to be twice. They pushed it so hard that it just became all about the most broken things you can do with it instead of about, like, I think a cool value Ephemerate can be cool. The problem is that getting to do it twice for 1 mana is not value ever. It's always kind of messed up.
What if I was just like Ephemerating Ingot Chewer? I destroyed 2 of your artifacts and got a 3/3. I mean, that could be pretty
If I had 2 artifacts to destroy, that's crazy. That's so good. Okay,
since we're in Lorwyn, how about a big one? Do you count Planeswalkers as modal spells? I almost just typed keyword Planeswalker into Scryfall just for a report from over this side of the room.
I think yes, but it is on a spectrum because I don't think I would count like an enchantment with a static and an activated ability as a modal spell. It's like the effect is going to change based on how many times you activate the ability, but the main difference for me is that the first turn you play a Planeswalker, it feels very much like a modal spell because almost all of them are designed to have a pretty incremental value plus or a pretty like decent value minus that might then put your Planeswalker in danger of being attacked and killed or hit with a small burn spell or something. And so that feels very modal to me, that sort of moment. And then the more turns it's in play, the more it does not feel modal anymore. It just feels like this is a grindy value engine. And I do think the design of a specific Planeswalker can lend itself to more modality or less modality. Like the dumb example is the uncommon war Planeswalkers I would not call modal. They literally have one ability you can activate when they come into play. You're going to activate it like the card does one thing. So those ones are not modal, but most of them are, and some of them more than others based on how those abilities tend to be balanced.
I think I agree. Like, on the face, the card says, do one of 3 things, or one of 4 things, so it's, like, extremely modal as a mechanic, but the way they play feels pretty different, that it is like, okay, now this is not just you having multiple options, this is about you going on a side quest and making the whole game about this, or this was about using this to generate some other type of value to add to your strategy, so I agree, it's on a spectrum.
Would you call Retrofitter Foundry a modal card?
It's, again, it feels similar where it's like, yes, you have options, but the card kind of does one thing, which is like, just be this value engine.
Gum up the entire board.
and make you think very hard about how much does it actually cost me to make a 4/4, and I don't know, but like there is so much interesting play to a card like Retrofitter Foundry. My favorite thing to do is like, okay, you're attacking me, I can like turn my servos into Thopters and then use them to block and then sacrifice them so I'm not actually giving up any value.
Your favorite thing you do with Retrofitter Foundry is the one thing you do with Retrofitter Foundry?
Especially if you know, my opponents have creatures with lifelink, that's really satisfying to do. I enjoy doing that. So how about from a cube design perspective? Like if you're thinking about, okay, I want cards that are modal because I want to be able to add more different effects on fewer cards and add some flexibility, or add more niche effects that otherwise wouldn't make itself into a cube or into people's decks in a cube. Do you think Planeswalkers can fill that modality or fill that role as modal cards in a cube environment?
That is a perfect question. First, I just want to say I don't think Retrofitter Foundry is modal at all. Like it does one thing, it does it very effectively, and the only situation you could maybe argue it was modal is if you had a cube where you also separately made tons of Thopter tokens, and someone could theoretically put it in their deck just as a way to upgrade Thopters into constructs for free.
Okay, putting that on my list.
To answer your question, do I think Planeswalkers in spirit add modality to your cube? I think mostly no, because the other aspects of Planeswalkers, the fact that they are permanents that tend to be much harder to interact with directly. There tend to be fewer removal spells directly for Planeswalkers.
But Andy, every creature is a removal spell for a Planeswalker.
I'm well aware, but you also know that it is very possible in Magic to build decks that can protect their Planeswalkers. That's a whole thing people do. I think the impacts of, especially a high density of Planeswalkers on a cube, are much more pronounced in terms of how it affects the viability of control decks, how it affects the texture of mid-range, and how it sort of changes card evaluation with regards to things like spell pierces and, you know, removal spells that actually can't hit Planeswalkers and burn spells that can hit Planeswalkers. Like, the way it impacts the cube, there are many much bigger impacts that are not just, oh, there are more modes available now. And I will say, too, you know, we talk a lot about complexity on this podcast. We design cubes with the full history of Magic cards available to us, and there are many, many, many Magic cards available to us to choose from. We've said many times before, you have to be sort of conscious of the complexity that cards add to an environment, because if you don't pay attention to that, it's very easy to end up with a cube where everything is just really massively complicated, and it becomes kind of overbearing to try and strategize and play a game of Magic for, you know, an average player that is not super invested in the game. I think most of these modal cards we've talked about complexity a little bit, but for the most part, the beauty of a lot of these modal cards is like it presents you with one decision once, you make it, and then the card is in your graveyard, or, you know, the card is now in play and the modes have been resolved or whatever. I find cubes with tons of Planeswalkers to be very paralyzing in terms of thinking about how the future turns are going to play out, right? They really affect my ability to project what I think the board is going to look like in 1, 2, or 3 turns, because you have to obviously baseline read all the abilities of all the Planeswalkers to figure out which of these abilities actually matter, which of these abilities might my opponent be going for. You have to then decide which of those effects or abilities your opponent is going to be trying to activate and how good it is or bad it is for them to activate it. You then figure out how much pressure you can put on those Planeswalkers to counteract their plus or minusing effects. So, like, what is the sort of clock? How fast are you progressing towards your ultimate, or how fast am I progressing towards actually killing this Planeswalker? Then you have to do all of those things with the assumed sort of bell curve of what you could expect your opponent to have in your hand. Like, okay, if they have one removal spell, how does this change my clock with regards to how fast you're progressing towards your ultimate or whatever? And immediately, as soon as I start going down that path, if there's like 3 Planeswalkers in play, I'm like, it is hopeless. I do not care. I am just going to attack you and ignore them. Or I'm just going to like make a decision that is like a shorthand decision because I do not have the mental capacity to like make the correct decision in this spot. So the fact that their modality is on board and face up and has this temporal element of like the loyalty counters are going up and down and changing options in every single turn, I think adds a ton of complexity relative to that modality that they add to the game.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, there's like, I think you're right that there is kind of this moment of modality. Like I think of, just to grab a random Planeswalker, Ugin the Ineffable. So every turn I get to make a 2/2, or I can destroy a permanent with a minus. It's like, I want to just be making 2/2s every turn, but I have the extra modality that if you have a threat that's going to kill Ugin, or you have something else that's going to win the game, I'll use that, and then I'll go back to plan A of start making 2/2s in the future. So there's a little bit of it, but then it does kind of warp the game around it a lot.
And the Planeswalkers I love the most, I should say, are ones that have a very modal decision that first turn you play them. Like, Each mode is very appealing depending on different circumstances. Think of like Liliana of the Veil, right? Do you want to edict your opponent or do you want to, both discard a card? And they're also ones that, relative to that complexity budget, I really prefer Planeswalkers whose abilities are shortcuttable as iconic magic spells. And this is what almost all Planeswalkers were in the early days. You think of Garruk Wildspeaker, you think of Liliana of the Veil, you think of
Jace the Mind Sculptor.
Jace the Mind Sculptor.
I guess Jace wasn't one of the first 5, but...
No, but it was an early one, basically. The first 5 Jace, I can't remember the one blue
Jace
one.
Bellerin?
Yeah, I think it is just Jace Bellerin. That one's just, draw cards in different permutations. It's very simple. Like, when the abilities can be shortcutted to, like, iconic magic effects, that is so much easier to parse for you and your opponent when that Planeswalker is in play than when you have, like, I love this card. I play it in Bud Magic Cube. That, what's the blue-black guy that makes the 2/3 rogue tokens that have Death Touch? No. The one I play that I like. Give me a second. I'm going to pull it up. Kaito Dancing Shadow. Yeah, I love Kaito Dancing Shadow, but its main ability that matters the most is create a 2/2 colorless drone artifact creature token with Death Touch, and when this creature leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
It's easier to say I brainstorm.
It's so much easier to say Brainstorm or Fate Seal You or Boomerang. I don't think about bounce lands. I think it's only non-lands.
This is an interesting question, though, where I wonder how much that is still useful to
just creatures.
People that are like more engaged with, standard or more engaged with limited, because I agree that in my experience, it's like having somebody say, I play this Planeswalker, now I shock, or I lightning bolt, or I brainstorm, or, even I thought seize you, like whatever. That is an easy shortcut for me, but I wonder if people that are more engaged with like mainstream Magic just have different reference points, and maybe that just either isn't as useful, or they would just have different cards that they would call to mind. Like maybe they wouldn't say lightning bolt, they would name something else that does 3 damage.
I think lightning bolt is pretty iconic
That's
to all
probably
Magic
the most
players. You chose a pretty bad example.
Well, it's right in front of me.
You say I think most mainstream Magic players don't read their opponent's Planeswalkers because they're playing Commander.
Okay, that's fair.
So there's no reason to say what you just say, like, this happens now, and it doesn't. I don't have to shortcut
you asked, do I lose now? Is that a threat?
Do I have to remove that or not?
God. What a game. It's an interesting point about the uncommon war Planeswalkers, though, that those really didn't have a lot of modality. Most of them are just, I do a thing 2 times. Like, hey, I have Kasmina, I'm going to draw and discard and make a 2/2, and I get to do that twice. So it's more like a card with rebound or a card with suspend even, that's like doing a thing over time.
But with more texture, because there is a window in there for your opponent to attack it to prevent you from getting to activate it the second time. And I actually think they are the sort of opposite of modal, and that they give your opponent options of like, I love the War Planeswalkers because when they are left behind, I think almost all of them, after activating twice, they still have 1 loyalty left, but they don't have an activation left. And so there's a static left, and your opponent is left with the choice of like, do I spend a whole attack to just get rid of the static ability? And that is an interesting question, because usually the static ability is kind of trinkety. It's like, okay, this matters. It's certainly not in the case of Narset, but that's a different situation. But usually it's kind of trinkety, and so it's like your opponent is left with multiple decisions of the turn after you play it, do I potentially sacrifice resources to prevent you from activating this a second time? And then after you have activated a second time, do I care to sacrifice a resource to get rid of this static effect, or just leave it in play and deal with it, which I think is very cool.
Yeah, and to be clear, I like these designs. And like,
I love them.
Kasmina is one of my favorites, and I've absolutely been in those situations. Her static ability taxes targeting your creatures, basically gives them worded differently. But I've definitely been in situations in my cube where it's like, okay, I would like to just be attacking you, but I need to get in this 1 extra damage on Kasmina so that I can double spell with removal spells this turn. And I think that creates a lot of interesting texture to games. I like that design of Planeswalkers that aren't necessarily sending you on the side quest and taking over the whole game and just giving you a little bit of modality, but none of these really do that. And they could create a Planeswalker that's like, okay, you're just ticking down, but you get like 3 pretty distinct options to choose over the course of 3 turns. There could be a lot of interesting design space there.
I also think it's interesting, always bears mentioning that if you've listened to Drive to Work or read some of Mark Rosewater's articles, you will know that one of the first designs for Planeswalkers they explored was more like Sagas, basically. It was a Planeswalker that would come into play, it would have a certain number of effects that would just happen in a predetermined order, and then it would either just sit there or it would go away or something. And the reason that ended up not working is that, obviously Planeswalkers are not just a game design object that, has to be balanced within the sort of context of the game. They were also a big sort of IP move for Magic to basically introduce the idea of main characters to the game that it didn't really have before. You had like protagonists at the center of stories, but those characters were by design stuck in a particular plane, and like you would leave them and you would never see Gerard ever again or whatever until you came back to Dominaria. And the whole point of Planeswalkers was we're going to make these beings that can traverse between planes just like the players of the game, and it's going to be like our new like focal center of our IP. And in that regard, they abandoned the Saga style design because it made the Planeswalkers feel stupid. Because if the second mode is like, bounce a creature, but then in between you playing it and that second mode going off, your opponent like return their own creatures to your hand, and now that mode does nothing.
Or like make a wolf, and then wolves get +2/+2, and it's like, well, my opponent destroyed my wolf, so now Garrick is over here just like summoning at an empty space, talking to a tree.
They just seem like dullards, and you can't have your protagonists of your $1 billion IP be dullards. So I think it's interesting to think about because in many ways, I think Sagas are actually, more compelling as game design pieces and add more interesting texture to games on average to me than most Planeswalkers, because they have a lot of the same sort of introduce multiple effects to your deck ability, but it's so much easier as your opponent to know like what's going to happen next because it is predetermined. You don't have to think about what is my opponent going to do next with these abilities. You just have to think about what is literally going to happen next. They go away after a set number of turns, which means that they don't just sit around clogging up the board indefinitely forever. And you can actually tell a very compelling story if you know this is the sort of order these abilities are going to happen in, rather than not having any control over that because your player is going to get to decide what order they do them in.
It's almost like a linguistic and narrative reframing drastically changes the way that we think about a system.
I don't know. It's a pretty hot take.
I think the last point I would say about Planeswalkers is talking about modality. There is always this relationship to rate, which we talked about on the previous episode. And because of everything you're saying, like Planeswalkers were designed to be iconic and be the main characters, which also means they are just very powerful cards. So often what is significant about a Planeswalker in a game of Magic, especially if you're playing limited and often in a lot of cubes, it's not just about the modality, it's about the raw power level that is what sort of takes over the discussion around Planeswalkers.
Yeah, it's a very concise way to put it. Like, in addition to this new game design texture of like, different abilities you can activate every turn for this like new resources, loyalty counters rather, they also just had to make them really powerful and mythic rares because that was the whole point. I know there weren't mythic rares in Lorwyn. Don't get in the comments.
When were mythic rares?
A set or two later. It was very, very close after. We're still in Lorwyn, Anthony, with the next modal mechanic, which is the commands, which in Magic has been shortcutted to a choose 2 options of 4 available options. And we first saw those in Lorwyn. They would come back later on in Khans block, and then they've also been used in some Modern Horizon sets and some other supplemental products, but the pattern of giving you 4 options and you get to choose any 2 of them we see first in Lorwyn, and the most iconic command is, of course, Cryptic Command.
Which we did talk about these a little bit with the charms, because they've revisited this pattern a couple of times of creating a sort of configuration of a menu style, like really explicit modal card of just choose some abilities, but for each sort of cycle of these, the number of options, the number of choices you get, they've given a different naming convention to that set of cards.
Did we talk about how we liked commands versus charms in that first episode? And if so, what did we say?
A little bit. I think that for both of these, I kind of go back and forth on how much I like that kind of naming convention as a way to give you a hint about the cards. I also still stand by like not loving them just as far as like, hey, this is just kind of a menu of options, isn't very resonant. But some of them are better than others, and some of them, especially because the order of the way that the choices resolve, allow you to sort of make the cards function in different ways, which is interesting. Like, I really like when the modes relate to each other in some way and not just be like, okay, well, here's my plan A, and if that doesn't work, I'm just going to draw some extra cards.
I'm trying to do some back-of-the-napkin math here. Am I correct that with commands, choose 2 of 4, there are 6 different potential results of the spell, resulting effects of the spell? You have AB, AC, AD, BC, BD, and CD, right?
I trust you.
I think I'm right about that. I like the fact that wording it as here are 4 options, choose 2 is a pretty simple wording. It's pretty clear. Like, I think oftentimes in the commands, like one of the modes is pretty obvious. You're like, well, I definitely want to do this, right?
Sure.
You think about Cryptic Command, I'm definitely countering this spell. Then it's like, do I also want to draw cards or tap my opponent's stuff down or whatever? Like, I think oftentimes one of the modes is kind of obvious based on context, and then you get to like choose which thing to add onto it. I think it's a pretty good way to linguistically put a lot of options on a card, because it is essentially a card with 6 modes. Get at me in the comments if I did that math wrong.
He literally did it on his fingers, so...
It's a card with 6 modes, which is a ton of modes. If they wrote out those 6 modes, to your point, with a different sort of pattern where Cryptic Command either said, choose Counter a spell, draw a card. Counter a spell, tap all your opponent's creatures. Counter a spell, return target opponent to its owner's hand. Tap all creatures, return target opponent to like if they wrote them all out, it would be so like overbearing. But I think it's a pretty good little like trick to actually give you a ton of modality on a card without it feeling overbearing.
Yeah, and there's actually an interesting difference between the charms and the commands, which is, I think we both like the charms in that there are effects you can put on a charm that you wouldn't put into a cube for just that effect.
Right.
And a player probably wouldn't put that card into their deck. You know, maybe it's just target creature gets -1/-1 for 3 mana, or you blink something, ephemerate something one time, or counter an activated ability, like things that are just not quite worth a card. And a charm is interesting because sometimes you'll put that card in because you really like effect A that destroys a creature or draws you cards or counters a spell, something that's much more impactful. And it's nice to have that 10% of the time where you're like, oh, actually, I do want to do this trinkety thing now. And that ends up being pretty cool and creates more texture and variability between games. The commands are different in that they are not only putting extra effects in them into the sort of game environment, they're also forcing players potentially to choose those because they're saying, oh, I really want to do this thing because it destroys a creature. And also I'm going to choose one of these other options because I have to.
Cryptic Command is such a great example of this. People do not play cards that say tap all your opponent's creatures.
Right, that's a great example.
That is not an effect that people put in their cubes almost ever. Those cards do exist, like Exhaustion is out there or whatever.
As somebody that's recently lost some games to Exhaustion in a couple of cubes, that's not necessarily true.
We have Alex in our cube design play group who's a true sicko. But
I hope everybody has an Alex in their play group.
But most people are not putting Exhaustion or Giga Drowse or whatever in their cubes.
Giga Drowse, what a name.
But putting it on a card like Cryptic Command, you find that it is often insanely powerful. Like, it is oftentimes a decent chunk of a time walk, especially when you are also drawing a card or countering a spell. Like, it becomes a really, really, really potent mode on that card that completely changes the clock, messes up how your opponent planned their whole turn or whatever. I think to your point, like, it is a great way to get those kinds of effects in a cube and have people play with other options that they would maybe not even think, oh, this is the thing I want to main deck, until they actually are staring at it in their hand and looking at a board state and saying, you know what, I do want to tap all your creatures.
They've also printed a lot more commands. They've revisited this pattern more often than I remembered.
They sure have. One of my favorite cards that I think, we don't talk a lot about just like, Magic's most powerful cards in this podcast, but Witherbloom Command is a card that I think has been long overlooked by cube designers. And it is actually starting to see some legacy play right now, and it's, dabbled here and there, and it's certainly not like a staple, but it is a card that is starting to see a little more eternal play as the meta shifts around. That's a card that I think is very powerful and exactly the kind of thing I like to do in my most powerful cube, where it's like, all right, here's like 2 kinds of like dinky removal spells. You can like remove a dinky non-creature permanent, or you can kill a small creature. In rare circumstances, you can like buff one of your own creatures if you want, because of the way this ability is worded. And we're going to draw a land onto it, right? With all the other upsides of like, also you mill stuff over, so you can like fill your delve cards. Like, it does so many little tiny things that I find almost always adds up to like a really good deal for 2 mana.
And obviously Verdant Command makes squirrels, so that's my favorite.
Of course. We all love Verdant Command. We love making squirrels here.
We love casting spells.
Anthony, the rate at which we're going through these has significantly slowed down from episode 1, when we also didn't get through that many. I think we should do one more, which is the last sort of modal mechanic we are sort of flagging here in the Lorwyn block, which is Reinforce. A mechanic which I know at least has a couple cards that you are a big fan of.
I do like putting counters on stuff. This is again in that category where I'm like, does this make sense as a modal mechanic? And I think it sort of
Absolutely.
does. Like, you have 2 ways to cast a spell, but I wonder if this also just fits into a broader meta category of like, Reinforce is kind of just channel but made more narrow. So all of the cards with Reinforce are, again, can be on whatever kind of spell you have, a creature or your pump spell or your removal spell.
Or land.
But it also has the second ability to pay some mana, discard the card, and put a counter or multiple counters on a creature.
Speak on it, King. Pop off.
I mean, I just love talking about like the modality as a way to get kind of trinkety effects into a cube. And just like, oh, I want to have an instant to put a single counter on my creature is not necessarily something you want to do very often. But when it comes up in a game and it lets you win a combat or it lets you trade up for something that's very relevant, it matters a lot. It is, again, like this channel style modality where you're discarding the card and activating this ability. It doesn't count as casting a spell, which I find sometimes is cool and sometimes very frustrating. I think we talked about this in the previous episode where I have a lot of things that care about being targeted by a spell or casting a spell, and then it's like, well, it doesn't actually work that way, or you can't counter it, which can be an upside or can just be kind of a weird gotcha.
I think in this case, I do not mind that this is not counterable because it is, generally speaking, such a small effect. It is not a huge impact on the game. The one exception maybe is Renzron Hydra, which is a pretty powerful card in your regular cube. I think one of the more powerful cards in green. And a big part of the reason why is not the main casting mode of a, scalable card with reach, but instant speed, being able to buff something by 3, 4, 5 power often just steals games out of nowhere. And that is sort of the big reinforce effect that I maybe wish was more interactable. But the other thing it's inherently of reinforce is that I never feel bad about that either, because I can always just interact with the creature you're targeting with the reinforce. And if I can't interact with a small creature, then I deserve to lose the game. I don't know.
That's true. The type of interaction that you have definitely matters, and you can still interact with reinforce because it still goes in the stack with your bounce spells and your own pump spells and things like that. I did actually cut Renzron Hydra from my cube specifically that reason of I just was pushing more heroic stuff in green, and it was just
that is annoying.
Too disappointing every time you were like, okay, now I do this, and I'm going to have this great combo, and then worst case, your opponent reminds you, actually, it doesn't work that way.
Just use all the new heroic cards, Anthony. I forget what the new mechanic is called on the mice.
Valiant.
Yeah, Valiant. That'll trigger on it. I just fell in love with Rustic Klaken for Take 5, just because I really want you to play Rustic Klaken and reveal Nameless Inversion, and then it comes into play untapped.
I love some Kithkin Matters in Magic.
I'm so into it. I also genuinely think it's going to be a good card there, because I also have Keyword Soup as one of the mechanics, and so putting a little +1/+1 counter on your Swiftblade Vindicator. Yeah, I can't stop thinking about Take 5 right now. Been making a lot of videos about that on YouTube. I've had a lot of guests actually on recent episodes of that, so if you want to check out the YouTube page for some less formal, just cube discussion, I had Ryan Overturf on to chat with me about the Soulflare Chromanticore combination and how you might turn that into a package in this cube.
Soulflare Chromanticore. Classic.
And then I had Jane of the Ball Pit on to talk about Isochron Scepter and how to make it fun and cool and not miserable. And we talked for 90 minutes and didn't end up making any changes to the cube, and we're going to have to come back and do a follow-up video where we actually start adding cards to make Isochron Scepter fun and not toxic.
Can you, put counters on creatures? Is that fun? Is that not toxic?
Yeah, it's not toxic. You can do that.
Great.
That's
I love
cool.
that.
Yeah, Jane had some really sick suggestions for Isochron Scepter, and I think it's actually the perfect cube for it because it's inherently kind of janky, so I don't intend to put 2-mana hard counter spells or 2-mana hard removal spells in that cube, so I think it's going to be great.
But would you put a Shriekmaw in?
That cube, probably not. Got to get weirder with it. Well, Anthony, we made it through 6 more of Magic's many dozens of modal mechanics on Modal Mechanics 002. Maybe our numbering scheme will end up working in our favor as we reach over 100 episodes about modal mechanics eventually in the year 2042.
Tune in for the other 997 episodes of our 999-part series.
I think these are fun episodes. I like talking about these mechanics from a game design and cube design perspective, which I think is a rare perspective. I mean, we talk a lot on the show about how most other Magic content is just about what's powerful, and they don't tend to talk about what's fun because they don't get to choose what's fun. They have to play whatever's powerful because they're playing some competitive format. And instead, we're just talking about how these mechanics work and why you might like or dislike them, the texture they have, the way they change games and drafts. And I think it's fun. I like talking about this with you.
It's also funny to go back and reach for this old weird mechanic reinforced. It's only on 11 cards and be like, oh yeah, we've actively cubed with at least 4 of these cards. And there's something to be had here.
We've played with cards from all of these mechanics, with maybe the exception of Transmute. I don't see a lot of Transmute cards in cubes, but I think we find that as we go through all these mechanics, these are all things we've played a bunch with.
I'm excited to see more forecast. Sky Hussars in the future.
Not forecast.
We'll get there.
That's your challenge, listeners. Make the world's best forecast cube. And on that bombshell, that is the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Raider. Thank you all, Radio. Thank you all for tuning in. If we got any of the card text wrong in this episode, that was absolutely 100% intentional for engagement. When I said that Jace the Mind Sculptor could boomerang something, and then I said, I think it's not lands, and then I said a minute later, it's just creatures, that's because I know this the entire time. And so if you're commenting about oh yeah, you got something wrong, we trapped you. We tricked you into engaging with our content to boost our social media footprint.
We play with textless cryptic command, and we know the order of the abilities.
We know the order of the abilities, and we know that it matters.
And I will not recall them from memory and say them on the podcast, because I know.
No, we're not going to say them right now. It's actually toxic of you to ask us to prove that.
Exactly.
All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by Thinking Really Hard About Magic Cards, and then speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for talking about Magic on this lovely snowy morning with a warm tea. Very cozy podcast.
So cozy.